Welcome to the Astana Times. My name is Asal Stubalna, and I'm here today with Alimzhan Akhmetov, founder and director of the Center for International Security and Policy. Our conversation today comes at a pivotal moment when the world marks August 29th, the International Day Against Nuclear Tests. Alimzhan, thank you for joining us today. If you could start by sharing some insights into the significance of this International Day Against Nuclear Tests and why it is important.
Yeah, thank you for inviting and to talk on this very important issue. I believe that the International Day Against Nuclear Tests is very important, and as you might know, that Kazakhstan actually initiated it in 2009 to mark this as an International Day Against Nuclear Tests. On August 29, in 1949, first nuclear test was conducted on the former Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, and on August 29, 1991, Kazakhstan closed this Semipalatinsk nuclear test site and ended the nuclear era in Kazakhstan. Mm-hmm. And also we voluntarily gave up from nuclear weapon. And of course it's an important step forward towards nuclear disarmament, to a global zero, because it's impossible to nuclear weapons are needed to be tested. Mm-hmm. In order to be developed. So when we prohibit nuclear tests, it's a step forward to nuclear disarmament.
Mm-hmm. So, as you mentioned, Kazakhstan has a very tragic history with nuclear tests, and most notably the more than 450 nuclear tests conducted at the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site and its closure in 1991. So, what lessons can other countries draw from this Kazakhstan's journey?
Well, the most tragic lesson, I think, it's that developing this awful weapon has no advantages, as our people suffered and continues to suffer. As you know, we have first generation survivors from nuclear tests, mm-hmm. second generation, third generation, and now we have fourth and fifth generation survivors from nuclear tests, because these diseases with damaged DNA goes from generation to generation, and I don't know when it stops in the future. So this is the lesson that if you have nuclear weapon, it doesn't bring you safety and security, but the people are suffering still.
Moving on to some of the most important documents in nuclear non-proliferation, including the CTBT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Could you provide some insights into Kazakhstan's advocacy for these international documents and maybe what your organization has been doing in this area?
Mm-hmm. Well, these two treaties, in my view, are like a bit different. You know probably the history that we had the Nevada Semipalatinsk mm-hmm. movement, the role of Alimzhan Akhmetov and others advocates for this. For the closure of Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, and the closure of the former Semipalatinsk nuclear test site in Kazakhstan, I think was a huge step to the development and the signing this treaty, the CTBT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, this treaty did not still yet entered into force, because we have their so-called Annex 2 mm-hmm. of countries which need to be ratified, otherwise the treaty is not entered into force. Mm-hmm. And now we have 8 countries which still did not ratify it. And this treaty only prohibits nuclear tests itself. And this treaty does not cover computer simulation tests and subcritical nuclear tests. And the second treaty, mm-hmm. which you mentioned, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, To my mind, it's historical. In 2017, it was negotiated, developed, and opened for signing, and later entered into force. And Kazakhstan took part, very active part in negotiating it, and Kazakhstan signed it and ratified it. And this treaty, it prohibits tests also, but it prohibits nuclear weapon itself. So according to this treaty, you cannot develop, test, assist anybody to have this weapon, and you cannot have this weapon. So you know that we have three types of weapons of mass destruction: biological weapon, chemical weapon, and nuclear weapons. So biological weapon and chemical weapon, we have treaties which prohibits these weapons of mass destruction. And only in 2017 we had this important treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and it's international treaty which prohibits this weapon.
And to what extent these kind of documents are truly effective if the world still has nuclear states, in your opinion?
Yes, you know that nuclear weapon states, P5 and other states which possess nuclear weapons, and even states which have nuclear weapons on their soil, or states which are under nuclear umbrella, did not take part in this in negotiation of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. To my mind, I believe that having this treaty, it makes political pressure on that countries, and it encourages other processes in global nuclear disarmament process. And of course, this treaty is a huge step forward. For example, in 1996, International Court of Justice could not make a clear decision if a state can use nuclear weapon or cannot use nuclear weapon if it's a threat to its sovereignty. But now having this treaty, I think if states will apply to this International Court of Justice second time, I think the decision will be opposite, that it cannot be used under any circumstances.
And concerning these global documents and global nuclear non-proliferation efforts, what have been some of the latest initiatives coming from Kazakhstan?
I think the most important what Kazakhstan does now, it's active position, active participation in the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Because as far as I know, we have a committee under this treaty on Article 6 and 7. It's assistance to survivors from nuclear tests and environmental remediation. And Kazakhstan with Kiribati co-chairs this committee, and they work together to elaborate documents on a systematical method to assist these issues, to help survivors from nuclear tests, because we have these people not only in Kazakhstan but in other countries, and of course environmental remediation. And I think it's the most important now what Kazakhstan does. And on November 27, December 1st, we will have the second meeting of states parties to the TPNW, and Kazakhstan will become a third chair of in this treaty, third chair after Austria and Mexico. So a lot of job has to be done by Kazakhstan.
And concerning the domestic situation, you mentioned that millions of people are still suffering the consequences of nuclear testing. There are first, second, third generation victims, if we can say so. What Kazakhstan has been doing to support the people, to support the region that was primarily affected by these nuclear tests?
Me personally, I think it's, of course, not enough. Because myself, I traveled 3 or 4 times to the villages around the former Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. such as Kainar, Znamenka, now it's Kokentau, former Znamenka, Dolonь, Sarjal, and others. Mostik. And when I interviewed people, they felt very disappointed. As one interviewer told me, he's a second generation survivor from nuclear tests. He told me that before I was felt offended by former Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union conducted these nuclear tests. But now I feel, he told me that now he felt offended by Kazakh government as 30 years passed and not enough was done. And people told me that financial support is very small, like 4,000 or 5,000 tenge per month if you have this. If you have a document that you have a disability from nuclear tests. But I think the situation can and will be changed to a better side because, as I mentioned, Kazakhstan takes active part in TPNW processes and going to be a third chair. And under this committee on Articles 6 and 7, as far as I know, states suggested to create an international foundation to assist and help to the survivors from nuclear tests and to environmental remediation. With this foundation, Kazakhstan can also apply and provide some support to local people in our region.
Could you talk more about the environmental remediation? What is the process? What steps are in that?
The steps, the process is that our former nuclear test site is huge. It's 18,500 square kilometers, which can be compared with some small European countries like, I don't know, approximately Belgium or Israel. When I traveled to this former Semipalatinsk test site, it's still, when I traveled to ground zero, where the first nuclear tests were conducted, it's still the radiation is 20 times higher than normal till now. And but because of the huge territory, it's not like closed by a fence, and people still travel back and forth from one village to another. And when I visited Atomic Lake, I saw children swimming in this lake, and I know that it's rich for fish, and people fish in there and then sell this fish in, I don't know, maybe in Semei or other villages. And in this case, I don't feel safe. Though the water doesn't show that it has radiation, but the soil around the water, the bank of the lake is still somewhere has a high rate of radiation. And people, I think, well, you cannot touch this radiation, you cannot see it, and they do not, maybe probably, do not understand the risks. And this is the responsibility of the government to control this land and to make it safe. And some people I know from the villages, they have their cattle on these lands, and so for me it's not safe. It's
so
still
people should
dangerous.
not live there now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We do have enough lands in Kazakhstan, the biggest ninth territory in the world, and I think it's not a problem somehow to guard this territory. And
what can be done to raise more awareness about the dangers of nuclear testing? And again, as I mentioned, and I would mention again, that we can see more nuclear threats coming up right now with all the conflicts and rising around the world.
Thank you. It's a very good question. And the most important is to turn to people who suffered from nuclear tests and to listen to them. Because using this opportunity, I will tell you what my organization doing. So I learned this experience from a Japanese NGO. They bring their hibakushas, the people who survived from atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They bring these people to UN disarmament fora, and these people share their personal stories, because politicians, experts, diplomats often go deeply to documents, resolutions, treaties, and they forget that behind these papers we have just ordinary people who suffered from this weapon. And last year, with the help of international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and the government of Kazakhstan and United Nations, I brought a survivor from nuclear tests in third generation from Semei, Dmitry Veselov, and last year he took part in first meeting of states parties to the TPNW, and this year he took part in first meeting of the preparatory committee for the review conference of non-proliferation treaty. And his personal story touches people and diplomats, and he shows himself that it's not something abstract, you know. It's still people suffer from this weapon. And I think it's the most important to share these stories, to show that it's not something abstract, that nuclear weapon exists, and it's not only somewhere out there that you don't care. And you know, that like there is I remember this phrase that there is no planet B.
Yes.
We have only Earth, and
Do you think the world is aware of the nuclear past of Kazakhstan, of the nuclear journey of Kazakhstan? I mean, the nuclear testing, the tragic consequences that our country has gone through and still going through?
I'm sure that experts do know, but sometimes I meet people that they feel surprised that we had such a huge nuclear test site and that they were conducted up to 500 nuclear tests, and they felt shocked. And this is the matter that what I'm talking about, that we should continue this a bit of routine job, just keep going, telling the stories of the history of Semipalatinsk nuclear test site and the stories of the survivors, because now we have like coming young generation of experts, diplomats, and they mostly do not aware. And these experts and young diplomats are future leaders, future ministers of foreign affairs, future presidents.
Have you heard about the term Doomsday Clock? Can you explain it to us?
It's like symbolically shows the dangerous and the probability of the nuclear war or nuclear suicide. Something like 1 minute to midnight or 30 seconds.
You mentioned that we need to do more to tell the stories of people, to raise awareness, and we all have seen, I think, the recent release of the movie Oppenheimer, which raised the topic of nuclear security again on the agenda. How can movies like this and art like this help spread the word about the dangers of nuclear testing, nuclear weapons?
As a movie itself, it's a great movie. Yeah, it's Hollywood and it's 3 hours movie. But I felt disappointed that 3 hours movie just spent only less than 10 seconds of showing the consequences of atomic bombing, because there was just like a blink of abstract showing the survivors from and the victims of atomic bombs. And the movie shows like the process of developing this of the weapon. I'm worried that it can make more like the young people who watch this movie, make them like proud that US could do it, and but the movie doesn't show the opposite, the other side of the coin.
It's a wrong message, right?
Yeah, it's a bit like they didn't like lie, but they showed only the one way, the one side of the coin, and they didn't show what happened with the, for example, the survivors of these tests in Nevada, but they didn't show that after that they had the movement, so-called downwinders, that a lot of people died from cancer in US, and later, you know, we had this international movement, Nevada Semipalatinsk. All these facts were not shown in this movie, and that's why I'm worried that it's like, yeah, you said wrong message.
Could you share with us some of the plans that your organization, your center has in the area of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament for the future?
Again, with the partnership with SGI, we had an exhibition in Keroyen, in Astana, informing the people about nuclear weapon, what the consequences of the use of nuclear weapon, and I think it was very useful.
Thank you for joining us today, Alimzhan.
Thank you for inviting me.
And wishing you good luck in all your endeavors. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for more updates from the Astana Times. Until next time.